Welcome back to the Crazy Courage podcast, where we have wonderful stories of business owners, entrepreneurs, and professionals from all walks of life. And of course, we have another wonderful person that we want to hear from today. We have Janet. Janet is an executive coach from In the Lead, company that she started, and she's here to tell us all about it. Janet, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So what is In the Lead? Tell me about that.
So we do leadership development. We do one-on-one executive coaching. We do small group coaching, which I just absolutely love. Small group coaching is working with 3 or 4 leaders from the same organization at the same level. They learn from each other. They learn from coaches. It's a really great way to get more coaching for your dollar. And then I do leadership development programs. I have a great program from the first book that I wrote that focused on frontline leadership, how to be a manager the very first time. And then I have a new book coming out called Strategic Leadership, which is how do you successfully make that jump from kind of senior director, senior manager to the vice president ranks, which is a lot trickier than it looks.
It does. Yes. I can imagine that it would be. I love what you said. You wrote a book for people that are first-time managers. And I've talked about this with people before. And in my own personal experience, it seems as though first-time managers, certainly when you get promoted from working on the front lines to now you're the next level up, you're some kind of supervisor, you got a team under you, you've got to motivate and excite these people and keep them in line. But you haven't had any training. You don't know what you're doing. And I feel like this is exactly what your book addresses.
Yes, it does. Nick, thank you for that. And your experience is way more common than not. And I've not quite figured out why that's the case. America spends billions of dollars every year on executive development. And yet, when you're, in the executive ranks, you're, 55 or so, you've got some pretty set in your ways habits. And so thinking about how do you be effective in that frontline leadership role? And because we don't do any development, sadly, people don't have a lot of role models. And so there we are with brand new managers, like you said, who were promoted because they were great individual contributors. If you make an overlapping diagram, a Venn diagram, you would find that individual contributor skills are very different than manager skills because fundamentally you're working through other people. And I don't think organizations stop and consider that when they promote people. Most managers, at least 60% of them, report that they feel like they've failed in the first 2 years as being a manager.
Really? That's a big number.
That is a big number. Yeah. Employers say, well, if I develop them, they will leave. And that's just not true. If you develop them, they will stay because they feel invested in and that the organization cares about them.
Yeah, it's short-sighted, right? To not want to train people properly or not want to develop them, give them all the tools. And you're also not doing your company or your corporation any good by doing it either.
Well, and I think companies get overwhelmed by the numbers. There's 3 or 4 times frontline managers that there are at the director level or even at the vice president level. And so how do you develop them all? Well, you don't have to. A typical executive development program is a half a dozen, 9 or 10 days over a course of, say, a year, and there's individual coaching and lots of assessments. It doesn't have to be that large and complex. My program is just a day and a half, and it reminds them of the basic skills of how to give feedback, how to have good one-on-ones, how to coach and develop others. And it's stuff that is pretty natural, but our brand new managers don't necessarily think about it.
Right, you wouldn't.
No.
Now, do you have a certain niche or size of company that you work with?
I love working with mid-sized companies because they don't have all the resource for development and in coaching and so forth that, say, a $1 billion company does. I think you can make a great deal of impact. And I call small, 200 million to probably 700 million. I generally come in and work with the CEO or the COO. And so you have direct line to them, and you can get decisions made very quickly. They generally, smaller companies, the CEO will even participate in the training, which sends such a great and powerful message.
Fantastic. I mean, it sounds like the right way to do it for sure. Sounds like you found a good niche for yourself. Those revenues will sound like large revenues. So when you say mid-sized corporations, I know you're saying not the billion, $1 trillion companies, fine, but those are still fair-sized companies. You're dealing with some people that are managing some significant teams,
Yeah.
and resources themselves.
Yeah. Found that anybody probably under 50 million, that development just is not on their list of top priorities. Revenue is on the top of their priorities, and product development is on the top of their priorities. And so once they get kind of back to that stability level, like we're going to make it in the market, I think then they're ready for some enhancements of,
Okay.
introducing their team leaders to leadership development or coaching or team development at the executive level.
And that's why you're working with those maybe larger corporations, mid-size, because when you hit certain revenue thresholds, that's really, like you said, that's when you start to change your focus. If it was an ideal world, at what point would people start their management training? Like what size company would start their management development?
Depending on what their cash flow, I think somebody even at the $10 million, $15 million mark could start. What I'd love to see organizations do, whether large or small, is say, we've hired the future of our company. Let's get them developed now. Occasionally, I have done pre-manager programs. We cover the same fundamentals, and yet it gives them a taste of what that would be like. Because I do think some people get promoted to manager and they start to have to work through people, and they're like, oh my gosh, all these people problems. I don't like this. Let me just go back to my engineering job. Right. And so giving them a taste of what management is like, that would be my wish for every organization.
That's a pretty smart way of going about it, right? So people understand if they'd be looking for a promotion, or if they're thinking, I don't want to do that job. I don't want to deal with people in that capacity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I graduated from college with a degree in education. And at the time, there was a recession going on. So new jobs for young people were kind of few and far between, which is why I joined the military. But in education at the time, anyway, almost your last semester of college was student teaching. And so for some programs, that was your first interaction in a classroom. And I met a lot of people who said, "Ew, I don't like this. I don't like these young people asking me questions all the time, or some things I can't answer." Now, education programs have changed. And so students now have the opportunity to observe classrooms and maybe teach a 15-minute lesson. So they really get a sense of, here's what this work is like.
Okay.
And I think it's the same with management, to give them an exposure to what is it like, and how could you do it, and how could you do it well, is really, really important.
That makes sense. I mean, what you're saying is so simple. It just sounds like career day and you're a young kid, you're 10, 12 years old, trying to figure out what the world can offer you. And it just sounds like, this is great. I get to spend a day with somebody and understand how that job is, what it's like. Is it for me? And but something so simple as the next step in the corporate ladder for someone who's already in the company, who's already working that job. I'm kind of repeating what you're saying, but it just makes so much sense, and it's so basic, and it just should be implemented.
Yeah. And
Everywhere.
the reality in many organizations is you make more money when you become a manager. And
Right.
there aren't a lot of companies that have a technical track, even if they have very technical jobs, maybe research or engineering, there's no reason why you can't have a separate and equal track that says, all right, I'm going to be an executive engineer or whatever you want to call them. And their responsibility is to teach and mentor other people. But many companies aren't structured that way. So to advance financially is to become a manager and then a director.
I guess that's the big draw, right? You being promoted, no one says, hey, I want more responsibility. I want my life to be more difficult. What they're thinking is, I want more money. I want I want a nicer house. I want things, whatever that more money would give them. That's what people are looking for. And like you said, the only way to do that is to get a promotion. So your book,
7 mistakes new managers make.
7 mistakes new managers make. And are these things that you've observed yourself and you thought, wow, I'm seeing this all over and over repeatedly?
Over and over. So in the Marine Corps, what I learned is that leadership can be developed. And the Marine Corps spends an inordinate amount of time, as do the other services in the United States, on training and development. In the officer ranks, the initial school is 6 months long. That's all we do. We don't do a job, we learn. When you become a captain, you go to someplace called Amphibious Warfare School, which is 9 months long, and you learn about advanced tactics, but also about more leadership capabilities. And so leadership can be developed, and people need to have the willingness to kind of lean into that learning.
And of course, the military is incredibly structured, right? And I know you got that over your 20-year career in the Marines. Surely some of that we should be incorporating into the corporate, right?
Yes.
Just even a fraction of it, just so we can take some. I understand it's not necessarily feasible to send someone away for a 6-month training course in every company, certainly in a smaller company. Like you said, that's not going to be on their radar. They're not thinking, well, one, I don't want to be without this person for 6 months. I don't want to be paying for this training course either. So that doesn't even register. But as you get to the higher revenue plateaus, you really got to start thinking about, because your company's getting bigger too. So you can't afford to have everyone just doing things willy-nilly. And I've seen that too. You start off with a small company, one person, you grow your team to 4 or 5 people. As soon as you hit around 10, you really got to start putting policies and procedures in place for your staff, because otherwise,
absolutely,
the nuts are going to start running the aside, right?
Yeah. And I think that number 10 is almost a magic number, somewhere between 10 and 12, because the work then of the organization becomes more complex.
Right. Everyone's wearing different hats, right? They all have different responsibilities, but they all have to be able to work together, accomplish common goals.
For that kind of team, they maybe don't need leadership development, but they maybe need team development. Spending a half day all together talking about how are we going to work together? What matters for this team? What are our communication protocols? What are expectations for each other? I'm just amazed when I do a halfway day leadership team development with a senior team, how much better they get in a very short period of time. Because so often in those small businesses, they spend all their time talking about survival. Is there another product in the pipeline? All the products late. Are we going to introduce it to the market? And so it's very easy in those first few years for all these 10, 12 people to be going in multiple directions to figure out what's going to stick in the marketplace. And I think by bringing someone else in like myself to just help them reground in how are they going to work together makes such a difference.
Just taking a step back, right? Taking the time out to do that. Bringing in someone like you is a good excuse to do that. Like you said, day to day, people aren't necessarily focused on. They don't have time, stuff to get the team together. You really need to plan it out, right?
You're right. Exactly.
So now you've traveled the world. You've done a lot of stuff. Tell me, how did it all start? Like, how did you take the plunge. Like you were in the military for 20 years. I know you retired from the military, right?
Right.
You
I
retired from
retired
the
from the
military.
reserves, so I wasn't there full time, but
Okay.
it was a pretty big commitment even when I was working. I got off active duty and went to work for a government contractor, very large one in Washington, D.C. And I appreciated that because we were doing mostly military, stuff, software systems and things. And so I understood the language pretty well. And I worked with mostly former officers or retired officers. So it made it really easy. Then I got into consulting with a couple of larger firms. And I liked that work because it was always different. You'd have a 3-month project doing such and such, and then you'd have another 4 or 6-month project doing something different. And so I liked that variety. And eventually I decided I could stay inside an organization, kind of climb that ladder, or I could go out on my own. And that proved very fruitful for myself and my family.
To go out on your own, right?
Yeah, I did. I got very fortunate. I talked to a lot of people who are thinking about becoming a consultant. And there's a couple of things. Some of us got really lucky in a big project just landed in their laps. With me, it was a large change management project with a very large name brand firm. And that happened to last 2 years. It was supposed to last a year and then it continued. And so that really got me started. But I do think when people hang out their shingles, you got to let every single person know that this is what you're doing and then follow up with them very rigorously. Still to this day, I don't think a lot of my work comes from my LinkedIn messages and somebody is like, oh, I've heard from Janet 3 or 4 times. Maybe I'll call her as a coach. It seems to come from, I have a friend who's running a business and he needs some help with his team. Janet, would you be interested? So I think really spending time on your network and not letting it down, certainly sharing content in the marketplace in LinkedIn is very helpful. But I think following up with people, remembering that they just started a new job or they just had a baby or they just moved across the country and checking in with them and saying, how are you doing? I think that's really, really critical. I think the other thing that's probably more scary is how do you set your rates?
Yeah, that's a big question, right?
Always a big question. I don't often want to share what my rates are because my rates are pretty high these days because I've been doing this for 20 years. But I do keep track of what at least my field is paying. And so I kind of give people the range. You're going to start lower than normally, and you might take a dip in salary because you have to pay your own taxes. But what I tell people is when you introduce yourself and somebody says, how much is this going to cost? Or what's your hourly rate? What can you feel comfortable saying out of your mouth? It's really just that simple. I charge $200 an hour or $800 an hour or $50 an hour. Whatever you think, you've done your research, you know what the market will bear, and what can you realistically say? And over the years, I've been much more confident in saying what I think I'm worth, and I'm getting it.
And I hear what you're saying. And it sounds like such a simple thing. You just say the number. But I know so many people that just devalue their services. They don't charge enough. They're so worried that they just won't land the contract. They won't get the job. So they say, well, no, I'm only worth minimum wage. Some very low ball offer. And then you're kind of stuck with it because you can't turn around as a client and say, oh, I meant twice that. You want it to come out of your mouth. Like you said, you say that number that's kind of fixed in stone unless they want to negotiate you down a little bit. But it's hard to go up.
Nick, let me just finish on that one. How I handle that is I've learned to say to the potential client, what do you think you'll be spending on this initiative? So if they say $5,000 versus $50,000, then that's a scope differential, right? I'm going to do a lot less work for $5,000 than I am for 50. And my rates won't necessarily change, but that is a very effective way to deal with that. How do I set my rate?
Right.
And if they only have $5,000, or sometimes I've proposed at say 25,000 and they're like, oh, we had no idea this was going to cost that, Janet. How about 15? And they don't get $25,000 worth of work for 15,000. They get
Sure.
a subset of that work for $15,000. So I think you have to get good at scoping. And I think the third thing about that whole rate thing is I encourage people to actually sit down with a spreadsheet and think about how much you used to make, and then figure out what income your family expects you to generate. You have to add 30% for your taxes because you're paying them yourself. And then back into, so if I have to deliver, I don't know, $6,000 a month to my family, you can just do the math. You add 30% and then you figure out how many hours I have to work to get to $6,000 a month. And I think a lot of people that are going to hang out their shingles don't do that deliberateness. And then, Nick, as you say, they're stuck with these low rates.
Yeah. Is it something you want to work up to? Is that ideal salary? Because I mean, when you're first scrambling to find that one client that's just going to give you the experience, you want to wow them, you just want to land the client. Because you got to eat. You and your family have to. You decided you're putting out your shingle. The rent's got to be paid. Groceries have to be done. I mean, I see so many people kind of lowball just so they can get that first client.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Well, I would encourage those people to talk to other people that are doing the same work in their field. And I have found, particularly because of COVID, people are very willing to have conversations with you, even a competitor of yours, and share what they know and how they're doing. I may not share my rates exactly, but I'll share, here's what the market seems to be doing. Now, granted, I've got 30 years experience, a PhD, and then this marine thing in my background. So I have earned the right to charge what I charge. But as someone starting out, they're probably going to be at the 15, 20-year mark in their career, and they've already proven themselves as an expert in their former company. Okay. And so finding out what consultants make in their field is really important. And then setting them accordingly.
It really wouldn't be fair for someone new starting out to compare to what your rates are anyway. I mean, unless you wanted to give them an idea of, hey, this is what you could get to if you put in the time. But really, like as a day one type of number, I'm with you. That's not relevant. That's not what they need to hear. They need to hear some hard facts about the range. And you're at the low end of the range today. You can work your way up the range. And, it's going to matter a lot where you land in terms of clients, what kind of consulting work you're doing, your niche, right? If you're working with a lot smaller clients, they're going to have a lot smaller budgets to go with it. So your range has to kind of accommodate for that. So for someone to say, hey, Janet, how much can I make? Well, the answer is going to be depends. And at the end of the day, it's going to depend on how much work you're willing to put in to be able to do it. But I think you touched on one point that is very important, is that you have to tell people. And I know I've spoken to a few people in my personal life. I've spoken to people on this podcast where they're hesitant to tell their network, to put it on even LinkedIn as their description, to say that they do this work. Imposter syndrome. They didn't have the experience. They may have had the knowledge. They might be ready to do it, eager, but because they didn't have any actual clients yet, they felt that they weren't ready to tell people, which is kind of backwards thinking, because you want clients, you have to tell people. They can't read your minds, right? So you have to put it out.
Can't.
Like you said, you have to tell your network, and you have to nurture and your network and stay on top of it. Reach out to people. Someone you met 10 years ago, call them up today, say, hey, Dave, I'm doing this now. Can you send me referrals? And who are you? What was the last time I saw you?
there's a nuance to all of that, Nick, is
Yeah.
tell people, well, think about who you went to college with. It'll be 20 years since you connected with some of those people. It's fun to reconnect. And you're not asking them for work. You're asking them for other connections. I'm going to hang my shingle out in XYZ, and I'm looking for a company that's this size to this size. Does anyone come to mind? Is there anybody in your network that might fit that you'd be willing to make an introduction to? So you're never, with those first connections, looking for work. You're looking for connections.
Yes, you're right. You're looking for connections. And I think that's what's important. Even if you're not thinking of starting the business today, if you're starting anything down the road, possibly
Mhm.
work on your network now, it's like a living thing, right? You have to
Yes,
keep
it is a
feeding it,
living thing. Yeah.
right? You don't feed it, it will die. Your
Yeah.
network will go away. They will keep the connections with the people that are active. And I think networking isn't easy. It doesn't
Yeah.
come naturally to everyone necessarily. But to stay on top of it, I think is gold.
Yeah.
Because it's something that, and it's for anybody really. And if you're an employee or in the job market, sometime down the road, you might want to change careers. You might want to
Mm.
work for a different company.
Yep.
You need to have some connections. The world, it's all about who you know,
Yeah.
right?
It's such good advice, is to stay out there. In my new book, it's about a strategic leader's mindset. And there's a chapter about being outward focused as an executive. And it's amazing how many executives have gotten laid off in the last year. And they say to me, Janet, I don't really have a network. I was so busy working for this company that, I can't remember the last time I went to a social event. I can't remember the last time I went to an industry conference. And, I just tell them, well, now's a good time to start. Find
Yeah.
some networking groups that are similar to you and just get started. You got to get over your fear. And when I go to networking events, a little bit of drudgery for all of us. I set a
Can
challenge
be.
for myself. I'm going to learn something new tonight. And so I walk into the room thinking, what might it be? I have no idea what I'm going to learn tonight. And it might be about lake populations in Minnesota, or it might be some new bill that's traveling across the United States, or something that is obscure information, but it's also interesting. And I really find that helps me get through a networking event and allows me to talk to quite a few people.
Interesting. I mean, those networking events, you only get out what you put in. Like if you go in, you just sit there by the bar with your drink, not talking to anyone, just watching the world go by. You're going to walk away thinking, wow, didn't get anything out of this. And for networking events, the big thing to remember is that everyone was there for the same reason. They're there to network, right? They're there to meet people. Those aren't easy for me. I'll say I'm a extroverted introvert, right? Like
Okay.
I go to events but I find it really hard to find that icebreaker and really talk to people. So I have to push myself. Sometimes
Yep.
it's easier, sometimes it's not, but you got to do it. And I'm not sitting here saying it's easy. I'm
Nope.
really not. It's because for myself, it's not. And I know that a lot of people have their social energy battery runs low and it's tough to do that kind of thing.
I think we
Right.
often go to networking events thinking, I'm going to get connections. Somebody's going to do something for me. And if you turn that around and say, I'm going to meet some people that I can do something for. And so my opening question with somebody brand new is always, tell me about the work you do. And it's a really natural spot. Everybody wants to talk about themselves. And then have another question to follow up right after I do such and such. Maybe you know about what that work is, maybe you don't. Maybe you know a little bit about the company, or I've never heard about the company. If you get them, there's always a natural follow-up question. And so 4 or 5 minutes later, you're still talking about them. And they will naturally then come back to you and say, well, tell me about yourself. So if you can lead with a great question, I think that's half the battle.
Absolutely. And having that great question it doesn't have to be anything, say great question, but it doesn't have to be groundbreaking, talking about the meaning of life. It can be something simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So Okay, tell me a little bit more. We touched on it. You did mention it. Tell me more about that book that you have coming out.
Yep. It will be out in the middle of November. It's called The Strategic Leader's Mindset, Unlocking the Keys to Success. And the book was written for certainly senior directors who aspire to that vice president role, but also to newer vice presidents that are in that role. Making what I have found in my coaching is that transition from director to vice president is really challenging, because what got you to that role is doing really great stuff with your team. You deliver on time, you deliver under budget, you get stuff done. Well, a
Yeah.
vice president role isn't about as much about getting stuff done. It's more about connecting the dots with your colleagues and making sure that your work is aligned with the rest of the corporate work. And that's who it's for. There are 7 different, and I didn't count out 7, but there's 7 different mindsets, and it's not a competency book, but rather a book that challenges you to think about things in a different way.
And every organization is like this. As you move up the ladder, it's a bigger picture that you're looking at, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
you're a new manager and you have a small team, your
Yep.
pictures, you go to director, it's not,
Mm-hmm.
and you're vice president, you're looking at probably the whole company or certainly a large division or
Mm-hmm.
however it's up. But as you move up, it gets bigger and there's more responsibility on your shoulders. Like more people are turning to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think it gets easier by any means. There's certainly
Yeah.
more pressure, but yeah, it's something you need to be aware of. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like you said, right? It just, you're on this upward trajectory and everything that got you there, put you there, but you're not necessarily the next day ready for that next position. You have to grow into it. You have to
Yeah.
be trained. You have to have some sort of help to get you to understand what needs to be done, the right mindset, right?
Right? The right mindset.
It's a
It really
paradigm,
is.
a
Yeah,
step, a
it's a
whole,
big paradigm shift. And I think we get so excited about that new role and there's demands on it already that we don't take a step back and say, now, how is this really going to require me to be different, to think differently now that I'm at the executive level than when I was at the manager, director level?
yeah, exactly. Wow. So
Yeah.
I think your books are going to start covering really, you're covering new managers, you're covering people that are upper management.
Hmm.
You really start to close a lot of gaps there,
Yeah.
possibly help a lot of people, which is great. And obviously, I assume it's all based on your experience, things that you've seen, things that work well, and mistakes people are making, and you're trying to help people avoid
Yeah.
those mistakes, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
But
exactly.
going back a little bit, you did say that your first account, your first client, when you went out on your own, sort of fell into your lap.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
now is that because you had built up a network? How did that come up?
You know what? I got really lucky because I was working for a consulting company and I was just tired of them. It was a very macho oriented company, not a lot of women, and it was just kind of tired of it. But at the time, I was in the middle of a really large transformation project at a food company. And so I said to my management, okay, I'm going to leave and I'm going to hang out my own shingle. Well, the client company said, we'd really like to hire Janet. She was doing some great work for us. Are you guys okay with that? And that's the best way to handle that situation is for the
Yeah.
client just to talk to your former employer and say, we'd really like to have them. My former employer was doing a ton of IT work with them. So it just made sense because they maintained the relationship. And
Okay.
so I went to work for them. So I got really, really lucky. And it turned out to be a long-term project. We were successful. And then it gave me the chance to rebuild my network, to talk about people. While that was a full-time project, I was able to insert just a couple of other things on the side and build out my business that way.
Wow, nice. You said that contract was only supposed to last a few months, but it lasted a couple of years, two
Right.
years, right?
Hmm.
What happened after that? Did you have anything lined up?
Yeah, I did. I'm a pretty good planner. And even as I talk to colleagues in my field, what seems to be happening, especially if you've been at more than one employer, which most of us have, they're thinking of a colleague named Sarah, and she had a really great background in OD. She got laid off, and she immediately then sent LinkedIn notes to kind of everybody she could think of, saying, "My position has changed, keep me in mind." And sure enough, there was one or two projects that just came to her, like, "Oh, Sarah, you've always done great work." Maybe it's a colleague that had left her former employer who is now ready to hire her. And so she initially had a couple of projects, that really couldn't support her. But over time, she built up just some nice work for herself, and she's gotten very, very busy. I think you have
So
to be
again,
patient. Yeah,
patience
go ahead.
and the importance
Yeah,
of a network again,
yeah, exactly. Exactly, exactly.
because you never
I
know when you're going
think,
to need that network, right?
yeah, exactly. I think she also found, and I found this too as an independent, it can get lonely out there, but there are other people that do the work we do, that I do, and had kind of a tipping point experience that I wouldn't used to talk to other coaches. What I discovered maybe 10 years ago, it was certainly before COVID, that if I talked to them, they gave me a reality check. My business was off. How's your business? I'm being asked to cut my rates. Are you experiencing that? So it gave me a lot of validity in, was I doing something wrong, you know, when I was in this lull? Secondly, Sarah's called me two or three times and we've just brainstormed on approaches because she did internal consulting for a very large organization, but then went out on her own and just very capable, but kind of needed just another person to say, "You think this will work?" And I'd say, "Absolutely. You're on track. You're going to be just fine." Oh, and I have this other resources I've used sometimes in that situation. Let me send it to you.
Great. So she's in a similar field, but she's not necessarily competition, but a colleague of
Yeah,
sorts that going to help out.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
fantastic. I've said that, right? The tide raises all boats, right? You got to
It
share the
does.
knowledge, share the wisdom. We're all out there helping each other. There's tons of work for everyone.
Mhm.
There's enough to go
And
around for
I
sure.
think that I think that may be the key to entrepreneurship is, to being comfortable to lean into your network. Um, it's a give and take. At every end meeting, I say, "How can I help you?" If I've asked them for something, and it may not be immediate, but it leaves the door open, saying, Janet, can I follow up on you on this? I'm being asked to do something that I'm not sure I should be doing. So you just create those. And I think no matter what kind of business you're starting, those other people that have been there and done that are really, really critical.
Absolutely. If they've been there, those are the people that lean on, right? You might as
Yeah.
well ask people who know firsthand how it works. And yeah, I expect, you've been doing this 20 years. People are probably coming out of the woodwork asking you questions. That's why they want to know what your rates are. Cause like, I just don't know what to charge.
Yeah.
And it's just not a fair comparison, of course,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're always asking questions. Now, your clients, are they all US based? Do you
No,
travel?
as you mentioned, I've done a lot of international work. My husband and I lived in Shanghai, China about 10 years ago. And so I did a lot of international work. I only speak English, but worked for a company called Corn Ferry, which had a great international client list. And so had lots of clients in Asia. Most of them were expats, but not just from the United States, which was also kind of fun. Lots of folks from Australia and New Zealand and Singapore and so forth,
Interesting.
and have done lots of work in Europe.
Okay.
Ireland, of course, comes to mind a little bit in not England, Germany, Switzerland, um, which is always just a fun and interesting, the employment practices in every country is so different than the United States. So, helping them talk through what they can and can't do with a substandard performer. Coaching is always a great next step because you might have to give them a 6-month notice, which is just awkward and dumb, but it's the reality of the law. And my only restriction is English only. But I've worked with lots and lots of leaders who are English as a second language and have learned how to do that really well.
Clearly that's worked out.
Yeah. Yeah, it has.
Nice. Oh, that's great. I didn't realize I worked with clients that were just all over the place, not just global companies, but, companies that are based in other countries. Now, do you travel a lot?
I travel when I need to. Once COVID got all done, companies really wanted to do live training because they were trying to figure out how to get employees back into the office. And training made great sense. Like it's the easiest one to say, we're going to do this live. It's way better than doing it on Zoom. And so I do that. I've had coaching clients that I've never met in person because they're in Seattle or Florida or someplace. And it works out well. We learned how to do that during COVID, and that's one of the benefits that did come out of COVID. If I do team development, I always do it live because you got to see the body language and how people are interacting and who's sitting around with their arms like this is just garbage.
With UV on the side of their eye, right?
Right. So it kind of depends what it is. I find with my coaching clients, they'll eventually say, I think we should meet. And they pick up the tab on the travel, and it just does make a difference in the relationship.
And you're happy to travel?
Yeah, I'm happy to travel.
Well, it's great. That works out. That works. I mean, again, I've had this conversation recently and a few times. COVID was COVID, shut down the world. Lots of terrible things, of course, but the things that have come out of it now, you have the option of doing live in person, or you can do some virtual meetings, or not all the meetings have to be in person. You can do some virtual. There's the flexibility, which is so huge, right? We always,
if you do professional learning is better when it's spread out 2 hours or 4 hours, and then another 2 or 4 hour session a few weeks later. And often an organization will have people, again, in the US, I'll use that example, 2 in California and 3 in Arizona and a couple in Kansas City and 1 in Minneapolis and someplace in New York. If you're going to chunk it out like that, virtual is probably the best answer. If I can get away with bringing them all together for the first session where they really get a chance to know each other, and then we move to virtual, that's a really good model. But to expect an organization to bring this group of senior leaders together for 4 half days, it pretty much takes 3 days to get there and back. And, that's just not cost effective.
No. And and your work-life balance starts to suffer pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just limiting yourself to people that are in your city. But this way you can be more global, right? You can have all the meetings with clients that you need to, do some in person as needed. I mean, it's not like Zoom was invented during COVID. It was around long before.
It was around a long time.
Now we take advantage of the tools. We understand how easy it is to use these tools. We were forced to do it, and I get it. A lot of people change their mindsets for sure, but it's so great now. I mean, I hate that we had to go through it, of course, but it really accelerated having these types of meetings and so connections. It's made us more global, more flexible. I mean, I love those parts of it for sure.
Yeah. I think when you're on a Zoom meeting, they end up lasting shorter also. You just don't get that same kind of nuance and interaction as you do with a live meeting. And so I think we are very efficient.
Yeah, it's true. The less of the small talk. Agreed. So, you've written 2 books. You've got 1 book out. You've got a second book coming out in November, in about a month. Is there a third book in you?
Well, it took me almost 2 years to figure out the second book.
Okay.
I'm not a journaler. I couldn't write another leadership competency book because there's lots of that out there. And so I thought, what's the group that struggles next? And I finally came on to this mindset idea that it's not about competencies, it's about how you think. And I think I did a really good job of describing what strategic thinking really is, because I think people have a bit of a mystery about what that is. And so it was a really enjoyable process. And I had 3 executives that did early reading as the chapters got built, which
Okay.
was so incredibly valuable. Um, I'm a real strong follower of Adam Grant. He's at Wharton and he's all about organization development, team effectiveness and stuff. And he's written, I think, 7 books. And in his latest one, which is about untapped potential, he talked about that he had this early reader group and they were very gracious in, as he says, tearing apart all the dumb stuff. And that's invaluable. Don't
Interesting.
write a book in a vacuum, I guess is the
Fair,
lesson
right?
learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like anything else, right? Lean on your network,
Yeah.
like you've been.
It is, Nick. Yeah.
Well, Janet, I'm going to thank you for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me and sharing your story. What a great story. And so many great nuggets of wisdom that you've been able to impart with about leaning on your network, making sure that you're putting it out there when you start your business, and then just making sure that management gets the training they need, I guess
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
we're all about, of course.
Yeah.
But making sure that your management's properly trained.
No, exactly. Yeah. It's been great, Nick. Thank you so much for the opportunity.